Joining me today is a sex researcher, a neuroscientist, and co-host of the Wrong Speak podcast, Dr. Debra Soh. Welcome to the Rubin Report.
Hi.
I am glad to have you here finally.
I'm so happy to be here.
All right, we got a lot to talk about. I thought the best way to start this thing, I don't like to look at my notes up front, but you had a line on your Patreon page that I thought summed up the whole damn thing pretty perfectly. Your Patreon bio says, "Creating journalism that defends science and free speech." You've come to the right show. All right.
I think so.
Yeah, okay. Should we talk about sex first? Should we just start with
Let's
sex?
start.
And then, because it all bleeds into one thing here.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay, you started as a neuroscientist, but you were sort of more attracted, for lack of a better word, to studying sex. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I decided to go back to school and do my PhD in neuroscience, and along the way I had the chance to do a placement in sexology. So I'd never heard of sex research before. I had no idea what it was, but it was so fascinating to me, and I thought it's crazy that we have the technology to look at people's brains and look at sexual arousal in the brain, and it tells us so much about what it means to be human. So from there I was hooked. I loved it. My PhD was in using brain imaging to look at paraphilias, which are atypical sexual interests, and hypersexuality in men. And I love research, I always will, but I made the decision to leave academia and work full-time as a journalist now because the climate had changed so much, even between when I started my PhD and when I finished.
Yeah, and that's why the stuff that you're talking about really is at the nexus of everything that I'm doing here, because now you're on the journalist side, but it's because of the hostility that you were facing on the academic side. So what is it that you were unearthing or studying that was so triggering to people?
Well, within sexology, you can't really study anything that isn't triggering. I'd say across the board, someone's going to get mad at you no matter what. But
even though you're really looking at facts, you're looking to find facts.
Yeah, exactly. And even with brain imaging, that's definitely, it's a growing field. The technology is legitimate, but no matter what, I think because sex is still considered very taboo, people will either project their own ideas and beliefs and values onto it, or they just don't see the value and they think, why is the government funding this? I feel really lucky being in Canada. We do have a pretty amazing scene in terms of sex research. And my colleagues do manage to get funding, so I think that's excellent. But my decision to leave academia, in the last 2 years, I noticed things were starting to go a bit weird in terms of the climate. And in terms of mainstream media, I was seeing piece after piece about transgender kids and how young children were socially transitioning, getting on blockers, pubertal blockers, and the media was basically saying this is the greatest thing, this is something that we should rejoice about, that these kids are so much better off after. But from a scientific perspective, the research actually shows that the majority of kids who are gender dysphoric actually outgrow their feelings. They're more likely to grow up to be gay in adulthood, not transgender. And so it makes sense for them to wait, not for them to socially transition at a young age. So I wanted to write a mainstream piece about this. And there's been a very long-standing history between trans activists and sex researchers, a very ugly history of activists going after sex researchers if they don't like what someone's study says or what they say publicly. So I thought about it for a long time. I wrote the piece and I sat on it probably for about 6 months, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to put it out. I asked a bunch of my colleagues and mentors, and they all said, you know what, the science is solid, but you know what's going to happen if you do put this out. And at the time, I wanted to stay in academia, and I said, should I wait till I get tenure? And everyone told me, even if you have tenure nowadays, it's not going to protect you. You can still lose your job. So I decided eventually I couldn't stay quiet, and I thought I'm not going to stay in an environment where I can't speak the truth, and I can't even pursue questions that are meaningful anymore because I have to worry about who's going to get mad, and then I'm going to lose my money, my funding, and I'm going to lose my job. So that piece went out. It was called Why Transgender Kids Should Wait to Transition, and then I haven't looked back since.
Yeah, so I've read the piece before, but I reread it this morning before you got here. And there's a lot here. So how much of this is just blatantly a misunderstanding of science? Like, I think there's partly that you have a misunderstanding of science, and then you just have activists who just want you to bow to them all the time. Are you able to sort of quantify how much of the backlash is each?
I think, to be charitable, I try to look at the other side and give them, credit and try to, think that they have good intentions. maybe people, I mean, it's pretty consistent. All 11 studies ever done on the topic of desistance, so this phenomenon I talked about where kids grow out of their feelings of gender dysphoria, all of them say the same thing. So the final statistic is about 60 to 90%. So this is the vast majority of kids. You can't really question those data. So I think what it could be is people, I mean, trans people have a history of having to deal with medical gatekeeping, of people telling them they don't really, what they feel isn't real. I do think gender dysphoria is a real phenomenon, and I do think we should have empathy for people who are suffering. So I think it could be coming from that, of that place of, well, we don't want people saying that this isn't a legitimate thing or that trans people should be forced to not feel the way they do. But in terms of, you know, these children, we should be thinking about the best outcome. So it doesn't make sense for them to transition if that's not actually going to help them in the long term. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, but I do think the activists, they, on some level, I think they know that they can bully sex researchers because of that history. They know that there's only so much an academic can do, and they've won a couple battles. So I think that's part of it as well.
How shocking was it to you when you were discussing this with colleagues, that they were kind of hinting you may want to wait on this thing? I mean, did you think that you'd be in that situation? And I'm wondering, did any of them sit on some other things because they were afraid too?
It was eye-opening, yeah. But I kind of knew. One, I guess, instance I can talk about is one colleague, Michael Bailey at Northwestern University. He wrote a book that upset transgender activists. And they went off after him ruthlessly. I mean, they really tried to destroy his life. And thankfully, you know, he's still considered one of the foremost experts in sexology internationally. But I would say that, you know, I've written about him previously. I think he's kind of been the poster boy as to why people are really terrified to say anything that goes against the trans narrative.
Yeah, so I think you've already hinted at this, and I know your work otherwise, but so you have no issue with trans people as people, just to be clear. This is purely about the science related to transitioning and hormone blockers and things of that nature of a certain age, where they're doing it as young as, I think you were writing about 14, right?
Oh, younger than that now? Well, yeah. I mean, if there's parental consent, definitely. And I have to say, for transgender adults, and I'd say even kids who reach puberty and still feel that way, I think transitioning is totally up to you. If that's what the path you decide to go, then power to you. I don't think there's it's anyone's business to tell you what to do at that point.
So are there basic parameters related to age then?
Well, there are, in terms of, I don't work with children, I don't do clinical work anymore, but in terms of the research literature, usually clinicians will wait until puberty and see how the child feels at that time when the body starts changing, when they start having crushes on their peers and that kind of thing. And the research does show that when kids start to, you know, have crushes and start dating, and that can play a role in terms of how they feel about their bodies and whether they do outgrow it.
But just at that point, your whole body is in flux. Your mental state's in flux, your physical state's in flux. And as you said, what did you say a percentage on that of how many of them turn out to just, they happen to be
60 to
gay?
90, so yeah.
So 60 to 90% of the children undergoing these feelings turn out to be gay. And then I assume the ones that don't transition, probably most of them end up being okay with being gay, I would imagine, roughly.
Yeah, and I would say, even, like, I grew up in the gay community. I have a lot of gay male friends, and they've said to me when I was young, I told my parents all the time I hated being a boy and I wanted to be a girl, and I am a girl, and why can't I become a girl? And now as a gay man, I'm so comfortable, I'm so happy. And they say to me, you know, I'm kind of glad I'm not growing up in this time, because I think I probably would have transitioned. Yeah,
well, that's why the external pressure seems so crazy to me, because you just don't know at that age. And even if you do know, waiting a little bit isn't gonna, for the science to flesh out, it's not, that's not gonna kill you. It's just hard talking about this even, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, what people also aren't talking about is that for these kids, in some cases, the parents don't want a gay child. And this is what upsets me the most. So if you have a little boy who's very feminine, he's likely gonna grow up to be a gay man. But if you take that same little boy and allow him to transition to female, when he grows up, he's going to appear to be a straight woman. And so these parents are being lauded as progressive when really they're homophobic.
Oh, God, how perverse that is. That's interesting what you just said about a certain amount of gay men that grow up, you know, and they wanted to be, or felt more like a girl or whatever, and then eventually grow out of it, okay. Because I never felt that. Like I played sports and I played video games and Transformers, all the things that my friends did, and I never felt like I was a girl or more effeminate. People always say to me, I don't seem gay, and I'm always like, I don't know what that, you know what I mean? Like, I'm married to a guy, you know what I mean? That's pretty gay. But I never had that. But that's sort of just interesting about the psychology of gay people in general. There are gay people that grow up feeling very effeminate, and there are gay men that grow up not feeling that way, and I'm sure there's women that grow up feeling very butch or whatever, and there's women that grow up that are, you know, lipstick lesbians and the whole thing. Have you done any research on any of that?
In terms of my research, no, but in terms of what studies have shown, it is about hormone levels in utero. So testosterone, if you are exposed to higher levels of testosterone in utero, you're more likely to be male typical and masculine when you're born. So whether you're male or female. So most boys are exposed to high levels of testosterone. So that explains when they're born why they are interested in male typical toys and activities. So for gay men, they were likely exposed to lower levels of testosterone, which is why they're more feminine. And the same with girls, if they're exposed to higher levels of testosterone, they're more likely to be masculine and lesbian.
Right. Even though there's obvious outliers.
Oh yeah, this is on average. On average, yeah.
Is there danger in talking about that? Because I would imagine that the certain amount of people in the gay community that would want you to never go down that road, because then you could end up in a place where, we would be able to prevent people from being gay, ultimately, if we can really figure out the science behind all this.
Definitely. And I mean, as a straight woman, I have to say, even I right now feel like maybe I shouldn't be saying these things because I'm not gay. I can't speak for the gay community. But as a former sex researcher, I'm very much a proponent of
I'd rather you speak as a sex researcher than a gay person or a straight person or anything else. I mean, this is the problem, though. You're you know what I mean? Like, you're an expert in this, and it's like, even for you, who's so brave on all of these issues, it gets weird to talk about. And even for me, it's like a little weird to talk about.
Do you feel like a traitor?
No, I am what I am, and that's all that I am. That's it. But like, I know that just even talking about this just gets people crazy, and I know what our Twitter feeds are going to look like after this.
You get ready. So I mean, it's crazy because even my colleagues who have the best intentions, they're doing this research because they just want to understand, why are people the way they are. It's not, there are no nefarious intentions there, but people are so quick to jump on. I mean, earlier this year, there was a study about using AI to be able to detect whether someone is gay by looking at their face. And so, again, studies have shown that, on average, you can see differences between straight and gay people, both men and women, in terms of facial features. And so everyone's freaking out about this study. And I'm thinking, why aren't we saying this is amazing that we are able to know this? And I mean, I think I have really good gaydar. I've always thought I have. And now I think, great, like there's actually some quantitative data to suggest that I'm not just making things up.
Right. And they always say, well, gay guys have gaydar, that there's something else that maybe you can see or whatever it is. Or I don't know that people say it anymore, but people used to say gay face. Like there's just something about the facial features sometimes of gay men. Maybe they were a little softer or whatever it is. I don't even know what it is. But like, people were talking about that in the gay community. Then it comes out through some sort of science lens, and it's like, whoa, we better watch out for that.
And the thing is, then researchers see that and say, well, I don't want to go through that. So then they don't want to touch that topic. So now there are eventually going to be only like 2 different things you can probably study, unless you know that what you're going to find is going to be politically acceptable, in which case you shouldn't be doing the research, because that means you're not actually doing science.
Yeah. What do you think it is about you that makes you brave enough to do this sort of thing? Because I've had a couple other people. We're going to talk about James Damore in a little bit, because you've also written about him and why the whole thing about diversity and all that. But I've had a bunch of outliers in these communities on the show, and I'm always curious what it is about the specific people that make them sort of put it out there and go, I'm going to do it, whether you like it or not.
It's probably my personality. Yeah, I mean, I just generally don't really care what people think about me. And I'm pretty stubborn. And I feel very strongly about sex research being taken seriously. And my decision to have gone into that field, you deal with a lot of stigma. As I mentioned earlier, you deal with it on both sides, and when you make the decision to go into the field, suddenly, when people know what you do, they will judge you on a personal level. So I think that was part of it. I grew a very thick skin from saying, I'm going to do what I find interesting. People can assume whatever they want about me. And that, I think that just translated into now what I do as a science journalist. But I would say too, and I'm sure you probably went through a similar experience, once you speak out, it becomes much easier. And I find I can't stay quiet now. And I find the people that are gonna, turn their backs on you, let them, because you don't need them in your life.
Yeah. Once you start, you can't stop, actually. If it's built into you, you just can't stop. So one of the things I think is really interesting is how, there's such a movement always to say that gay people are born this way, right? Lady Gaga even wrote a song about it, born this way.
Power to Gaga.
Yeah. And yet at the same time, if I know for a fact, like I have a friend who for many years was my lesbian friend, my one good lesbian friend. And she was, dating girls all the time and all that. Then about 3 years ago, we were sitting there and she told me that she met a guy. And now she's been with this guy for about 3 or 4 years and they're getting married. And she identifies basically as bisexual now, but she's exclusively been with a guy for about 4 years. But what I find interesting about it is that her lesbian friends have basically all turned on her. And these are supposed to be the people of tolerance and we should accept your sexuality and all that. But when it goes the other way, suddenly it becomes this other thing. Have you seen that before? I suspect you have.
I can imagine that. I'm guessing they probably think that she's sold out.
They think she's a sellout or something. Yeah. You're taking the easy road or something like that. Like every insane cliche. And I know her to be completely authentic and real.
How has she dealt with it? I'm curious.
It's woken her up in a zillion other ways. So for a lot of the other things that we talk about free speech and politics and freedom and all that, she's started to wake up to all of that. She was a huge lefty progressive, and now she's basically a libertarian because she saw that authoritarian thing. Why do you guys want to control me?
Yeah.
The second I think differently, you guys want to control me.
Yeah.
So now she's like the wokest of all of my friends, so to speak.
That's the thing. I think all of us are eventually going to have a moment like that where you realize what you thought was the truth is not the truth. And there's so many other things. It's like falling down that rabbit hole and realize you start to question everything then. And it's really liberating. But in terms of sexuality, that's very common. Female sexuality is much more fluid than men's. So men tend to be very category specific. If you're into women, you really like women, you're not into guys. If you're into guys, you really like guys, you're not into women. And then women tend to be a little bit more flexible.
It's like you find, there are supposedly straight married men that on the DL are sleeping with other guys, but I'm pretty sure there aren't many gay men that are in relationships or married that are sneaking out and sleeping with women on the DL.
No.
Have you ever seen one of those in your research? I mean, there's got to be, right?
There got to be some. What I think the first case is probably closet gays, and then the second case, I have to think about that.
Right, but if you were a closeted gay, I guess you might be sleeping. Yeah, I mean, I did it. Like I slept with women as sort of like an overcompensation, or I was trying. It's not even overcompensation. I was really trying. I just thought I should try, and I tried, and I tried, and I tried, and eventually I tried no more.
Yeah, I think also for gay men, when you come out, it's such a big thing. And I think to make that decision to come out is really committing to this. As much as, we don't like identity labels, it is an identity label. So I would see it as being less common for someone who's gay to be sleeping with women on the side, because he would have likely just stayed in that camp.
Right.
That would be my guess.
Yeah. So, okay, so you mentioned that you study a lot of this related to the brain and how a lot of this is sort of built into us. And you study this across is fetishes the right word?
Paraphilias, yeah. Fetish is a specific paraphilia, but across the board, basically kinky people.
Yeah, so wait, what's the definition of paraphilia then?
Unusual sexual interest.
And how's that different than fetish?
Well, a fetish is a specific object or body part that you have a preference for.
Got it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a couple of those related to...
There are a lot of them.
Yeah.
So I tell people this and no one ever believes me, but I'm actually very, very traditional, vanilla, not kinky, but I love it.
I was going to ask you all that at the end about yourself personally, but okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I find it super fascinating, and I guess it's my way of living vicariously, So in terms of different paraphilias, I mean, there's voyeurism, so, known as peeping toms, exhibitionism, so people who like to expose themselves, sadism and masochism, which are different from BDSM. So BDSM is consensual masochism and sadism. So masochism being wanting to be humiliated, sadism is wanting to see your partner be humiliated. BDSM is very much about consent, so it's not true masochism or sadism because partners will negotiate beforehand and not do anything outside of particular boundaries and that kind of thing. What else is there? Frauderism, so it's when people like to rub up against unsuspecting people. There are tons. I could go on forever. Yeah.
And so how are these all connected to the same parts of the brain? Is it the same mechanism that's working and the fetish itself is just manifested in a different
targets,
way?
Yeah. So with my research, when I was still a researcher, I found that for men who are kinky, when they look at kinky pornography, the same brain network activates as when non-kinky people are looking at regular or vanilla pornography. So it suggests that paraphilia is maybe akin to a sexual orientation, so that's not to say that's the same as being gay, but it's the same idea conceptually that it's someone's preference, it can't be changed, and it's with them from very early on.
Yeah. How does the internet play into all this? Because I know you've written about porn addiction and things like that, where now all of this stuff is so accessible, where obviously even 15, 20 years ago, it was a lot harder to get.
You had to go looking for it, yeah. I think people are probably able to test out different things and go searching for things out of curiosity, but if you really like something, I don't think it's because you happen to find it on the internet. And with porn addiction in particular, there's no research to suggest that's a real thing, that excessive porn viewing is akin to an addiction. Usually, if you talk to someone with problems with porn, across the board, there's always some other reason why. Either they're anxious, they like to procrastinate, well, they don't like to procrastinate, but they use it as a way of procrastinating and avoiding other things. It's not that they're actually addicted to pornography.
Right. So when you hear, though, that people will say, well, you're getting that dopamine hit, isn't that partly what being addicted, wouldn't you become addicted to that? Well, or am I understanding the term addiction slightly incorrectly?
That's true, but dopamine is released during a number of different things. If you eat a nice piece of food that you like, dopamine's released. If you see a nice picture, dopamine's released. I mean, it's reward, but it's responsible for a lot of different things. So I think that's one case of, I mean, I do have some issue with science journalists watering things down and liking to take one finding or one study and kind of, you know, representing it or misrepresenting it. So it's not really an accurate take on it, but I understand why people think that, because dopamine has been seen as the addiction neurotransmitter, and you see so much about porn addiction, sex addiction. I would say probably a year ago, it was everywhere. Everyone was talking about porn addiction and sex addiction, even though there's no legitimate research to suggest either of those things are real.
So when you've studied all of these things, what are you finding out about the brain as a neuroscientist? And can anything be done for any of these things if somebody was partaking in these things and either didn't want to or at least wanted to understand it or whatever else?
The biggest thing I would say is find a partner who accepts you for who you are. Because whatever you're into, especially for men, it's not going to change. And so the difference between someone who has a
So meaning women's kinks or whatever will change with time, where a man would be less inclined to?
Yeah, the same with, you know, in the same way with sexual orientation, women tend to be more flexible with their sexual preferences. So if they're kinky, they might be really kinky with one partner, or if they have a partner who's very kinky, they might be into whatever he's into, if it's a straight couple. But then if she's with someone who's less kinky, it might not be as much of a problem. Whereas if it's a man who's really into something, if his partner's not into it, he's always going to be into it. He's just going to have to hide it.
Yeah. Have you heard of this phrase, lesbian bed death? I'm all over the place right now. I'm just going into the vault here and seeing what I can come up with.
Yeah.
But have you heard this phrase before?
It means that there's no sex after a certain amount of time, is that right?
Yeah, that lesbians, it sort of burns very hot for that early period, and then the U-Haul shows up as the old joke, and then just like the desire for sex just disappears.
Just lots of cuddling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have heard of that. Well, men on average do tend to have a higher sex drive. So I could see if you're in a relationship where it's two women, how their sex drive might be a bit lower. Not sure what else I can tell you.
But not anything else on that. What are you really thinking about right now? Like in general, what are the topics that are really on your mind related to all this?
My concern, number one, is probably seeing how gender is being warped to facilitate particular political agendas. As you mentioned with James Damore, and seeing how that whole thing unfolded last summer.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because you wrote a piece on it. I remember the piece coming out.
I did, yeah. So I remember when that news first broke, that this sexist memo was going around, and I read it and I thought, okay, this is not sexist. And then I saw the statement from Google that he was perpetuating gender stereotypes. And I thought, oh no. And so I wrote that column for the Globe and Mail to speak to the science and say, you know what, the science that James cited was absolutely 100% legitimate, and there shouldn't be anything wrong with saying that. And if you actually read his memo, you'll see that he's not a misogynist. And we actually, so the podcast that I co-host with Jonathan Kay called Wrong Speak, we actually interviewed him for our first episode. And if you listen to him speak, you can see, I mean, he's very much for equality between the sexes. He says that if men and women don't talk to each other, that's going to harm both of us. But it was much easier for them to paint him as a misogynist and as an alt-right figure, because I guess, you know, there's nothing else going on in the news.
Did you feel that the article, or at least when James was able to get out there and say what he thought, whether he did it here or on Rogan or a series of other podcasts, did you feel that that was able to break through to some of the people that it needed to break through to? Like, I know it gets to the masses, right? It gets to the people who appreciate maybe what happens in here or on Rogan or things like that. But for any of the people that really need to hear it, the ones that are at Google or the ones that are setting the diversity agenda at schools and all that, is there any sign that any of this pushback against it has taken root?
No, I think it's gotten worse, if anything, honestly, which is terrible. I think they are so set in that mindset that you really can't say anything. I think reasonable people, if you talk to them, I was surprised actually at that time, because a lot of people that I knew that were really intelligent, really rational, had bought into this narrative that he was a sexist person who said that women are biologically inferior and are not capable of engineering or working in tech. And I said, well, why would you think that? Did you read the memo? And most people had not.
Of course not.
But then, because left-wing media was so adamant about this message, people just assume, well, they're not going to lie. Why would they lie? And, you know, we are in this industry, so of course we know, but I think most people just take at face value. They're busy, they have their jobs, and so they see a headline or they see an interview, they just think, well, like a mainstream interview, they think, well, they wouldn't be saying these things if there wasn't some truth to them. But no, they're blatantly lying. They're
blatantly lying. Has all of this and being part of this and now, you know, being very public about your opinions, has this changed your politics at all? I find that it consistently has changed people's politics. Usually it shifts people to more of what I would say is a classical liberal position, but a libertarian, just more of a less government position, because that's where I think at the moment the most freedom lays.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and especially the idea of the government. I used to be definitely more left, much more left. I would still call myself a liberal, but definitely now that I see, because I used to think, well, it's good for the government to come in and help people and to kind of set the tone, but now I'm seeing things that are not hate speech are being considered hate speech. And genuine facts, we're not allowed to say them anymore. So I'm much more skeptical now of government intervention, of policies dictating what people can and cannot do or say. So I would say I have moved more to the right, but I would still call myself a liberal. And I mean, the fact that I write about sex research for a living is pretty left.
Yeah, you're my kind of liberal, so you're good to go in here.